Hello and welcome to another long-distance sled dog racing season. This year I've decided to talk a little bit about the Yukon Quest too, which started Saturday, so we're 3 days in. And it's a bit different from the Iditarod, even though they're both 1,000-mile races. And you will see a lot of mushers who run teams in both races. It really says something about sled dogs that, especially these particular ones, the ones that run these long distance races, that they turn around and compete in another 1,000-mile race just 4 weeks after the start of one. And when I say compete, they're not just running in the Iditarod too. A lot of these teams are finishing in the top 10 of both races, well, top 5 of the Quest. So let's talk about how the Quest is different. First of all, it doesn't attract the same number of teams. It's got a smaller purse. It's also much more remote, higher elevation, more rugged. There are fewer checkpoints in it. So it's quite a different race. It runs in even years from Fairbanks to the Whitehorse in the Yukon Territory in Canada, and in odd years it runs the other way. So it's not as long-lived yet as the Iditarod. It's not as well known, but folks up in Alaska and Canada sure as heck know about it. So this year, so far, we've got Alan Moore out in the lead. Alan is a perennial favorite, as is Hugh Neff, and Matt Hall, even though he's fairly young to mushing, or to competitive mushing, he's an interesting case. He won it last year. I think it was his 3rd or 4th time in the Quest. But Matt Hall hails from a place called Eagle Village, which is a stop on the Quest. And he had volunteered there every year since he was a boy, before the year he ran it, first year he ran it. But Eagle Village is not accessible by car or truck at this time of year. Most people arrive by bush plane, snowmobile, or sled dog team. So I think sometimes we forget that sled dog teams is actually a viable means of transportation for some of these areas, and especially for the areas on the Yukon Quest. Now, it follows the Yukon River for a good chunk of it. It's going to be up on the highway on top of the world for part of it. If you don't know about that, I'll talk more about it when we get there. But it's much higher elevation. Out of Fairbanks, they do Rosebud Summit and the American Summit. Or is it Eagle Summit? Anyways, Rosebud Summit, and then I think it is the Eagle Summit. And then they will, after that, they will tackle the American Summit and King Solomon's Dome, which King Solomon's Dome is along the World Highway on top of the world. Anyways, lots of elevations, lots of remote areas. In the Iditarod, you will see some teams that stop and take all their rests in checkpoints if they can, or at least most of them. There are the checkpoints are closer together, and there are more of them. There's Rough Patch in Dazzle Gorge, and the crossing of the Bering Sea ice can be very, very treacherous. But in the Yukon Quest, because the checkpoints are fewer, farther between, because there are parts of it that cannot be accessed by truck, there's a certain loneliness that can come about, although most of the mushers don't experience it that way. They're out there with their dogs. Things can change quickly, as with the Iditarod, in terms of the weather. Blizzards are fairly common. A lot of times there's issues with ice flows because they are following the Yukon River. I mean, they're mushing along the frozen river. Right now, most of the teams are either on or through Birch Creek, which is a particularly windy part of the trail. Everybody seems to move very slowly, but they're cutting back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. So they eventually get there. They will be. We have the first teams probably getting ready to leave Circle right now. From Circle, they'll go through Eagle, and they won't see any of their handlers again until they get to Dawson City, which is about 300 miles away. Now, in the Yukon Quest, unlike the Iditarod, at Dawson City, the mushers can take a break. They can get help from their handlers to repair the sled, take care of the dogs. The dogs are allowed to have a sort of temporary shelter. It has to be open on both ends to let air through, but they are allowed those sorts of things. And they rest for 36 hours. There's a lot more going uphill and downhill in the Yukon Quest than you will find in the Iditarod. And it makes it more strenuous, I think, for both the dogs and the humans involved. So, anyways, we're early in the quest. They've gone up a few hills. They'll be going up a lot more hills in the near future.